Okay, here we go again. This talk is entitled The New Dissidents of Physics from the 1990s onwards. After Einstein became famous in 1919, there were many that opposed Einstein's relativity as being wrong in some way. Then later afterward there were others such as Herbert Dingle and Louis Eason opposing Einstein's relativity. As people get older they die, but the opposition to Einstein's relativity continues with new generations. I want to pick up from John Chappelle. Now this is Dr. John Chappelle, who's now sadly passed away. He was preeminent among those seeking clarity in the alternative concepts of contemporary physics, cosmology and natural philosophy. Towards that end he created the Natural Philosophy Alliance, and the Natural Philosophy Alliance has now changed to being Chappelle Natural Philosophy Society. So this is from an article in 1995, and it was when a dissident group was able to challenge the physics establishment, and at a physics conference about 24 speakers will gather to challenge dominant paradigms of modern theoretical physics and to discuss alternatives. At the annual meeting of the Southwestern and Rocky Mountain Division, which is called SWARM, of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, in May, these self-styled dissidents are planning to renew their attack on the special theory of relativity and Big Bang cosmology. And this is not the first time the group has met in a AAAS type of forum. And this is repeating most of what has already been said. This is a picture of that meeting, sitting around in a sort of scrambled way, and they say it's sowing the seeds of dissent and informal gathering of neo-Newtonians, and they've misspelt Newtonians, and when they mean neo they mean new. So these are people who believe, so say, in Newtonian physics, and they're trying to revive Newtonian physics after Einstein is supposed to have overturned it. So they call themselves the Neo-Newtonians. Go on to the next slide. The follow-on from the conference was the dissidents formed the Natural Philosophy Alliance, NPA, which later reformed as the John Chappelle Natural Philosophy Society, CNPS, and it's at this website. Anyway, looking at the rest of the article by Billy Goodman, he says critics of conventional physics include consultants, engineers, mathematicians, historians of science, and an encyclopedia salesman, but few physicists. And that's the group of the dissidents. You've got a wide selection of people in from different disciplines. They claim they cannot publish their ideas in mainstream journals, and that the bias against them is so extreme that in essence one cannot become a physicist if one criticises special theory of relativity. Indeed, the one exception to the rule, a physics professor at the University of Connecticut, did not reveal his skepticism of Einstein's theory until after he had a tenure. So that probably explains what happens. People decide they are skeptical of Einstein's relativity, and they realise that they can't then go into the physics sector, and they have to go into all the other different sectors like engineers, mathematicians and so forth. But they're still protesting that the physics is wrong, is in the mainstream. Now this is John Chappelle. He was at the time an unemployed historian of science who says he cannot get an academic job because of his views, and he has merged his spokesman for the dissidents who have adopted the name Natural Philosophy Alliance. And so this is the problem. You go up against Einstein's relativity, and if you make that known too much, then it's a problem in getting an academic job. Now this is what he says: speaking of the mainstream, he comments, they don't know our objections because they don't listen, they don't come to our meetings, they don't read our journals. When they reject our papers, they don't even bother to review them. Goodman goes on to explain, the dissidents by and large champion a theory of light popular before Einstein, which has its roots in Newtonian mechanics. In other words, they're neo-Newtonians, wanting to revive Newtonian mechanics after Einstein's supposed revolution to change away from that. In a Newtonian paradigm, the speed of light can vary depending on the motion of the observer relative to the light. So they are objecting to Einstein's postulate of the light speed constancy, and in my view that's probably been misinterpreted by the mainstream anyway. Most of the dissidents argue for the existence of an ether, a medium within which light waves propagate, such as water waves move in water. Physicists say the ether was disproved by the Michelson-Morley experiment a century ago, which did not detect any difference in travel time, as it should have if there is an ether, for two beams of light travelling perpendicular but equidistant paths. And so I'm rejecting when these physicists say the ether was disproved by the Michelson-Morley experiment. I'm saying that is a false claim. There are a lot of false claims about experiments made by the physics establishment. I have dealt with the ether, which can be spelled A-E-T-H-E-R or E-T-H-E-R in other talks, and pointed out Einstein 1905 was discarding the ether, and that was in his famous paper on special relativity. But later he seems to have changed his mind in 1920, and this is a quote from Einstein in 1920 when he seems to be saying that the ether exists in some sort of sense. And you should see my other talks such as the one Relativity Deniers for more information. Now this example, this article, New Scientist, suggests bringing back the ether. There are various other articles that suddenly turn up suggesting that the ether shouldn't have been discarded, and this one, for example, is suggesting it solves the problem of dark matter and dark energy. If you deal with cosmology, the Big Bang Theory has this problem of where is most of the universe. It seems to be missing, and I'm not going to go into details about that other than pointing out that the mainstream is trying to work out how to understand dark matter and dark energy, and it might just be a simple problem that they've discarded the ether and then hence it created this problem of dark matter and dark energy. And there's quite a few articles suggesting this. Now, there are many different types of ether that have been proposed, and so no experiment has disproved all the different types of ether. To say an experiment disproved all the different types of ether is just a misrepresentation of the experiment, and the mainstream seems to like misrepresenting what an experiment means. Goodman goes on, for as long as there's been a special theory, that's the special theory of relativity, there have been detractors, and so that goes all back to time basically of 1919 when Einstein became famous, and it brought Einstein's theories to the attention of a lot more people, and so people started saying it was wrong. As well as people going along with Einstein's relativity, there were people who were saying it was wrong. And Goodman is saying, but they have not been organised, and Chappelle says there is no major organisation has allowed them symposium to challenge special relativity. So this is up at the time in the 1995. And really what you should mean in recent times, the 1990s, because there was an organisation attempt made before World War II, and then that faded out after World War II. So really this objections to Einstein's relativity has been going on for a long time. It's just never been organised into a way of keeping that momentum going, of getting enough people to keep joining. He, which is John Chappelle, points to the San Francisco meeting, that was another meeting a year ago, as an important first step in winning respectability for the dissidents and forcing mainstream physicists to pay attention to them. And I think he failed on that. It didn't happen. Mainstream physicists didn't pay attention. Chappelle managed to get these meetings with the mainstream physicists, and it didn't really gain respectability with them. Now this is Goodman given what Chappelle says. San Francisco was to prove we could do it. We could get together, and at the AAAS we would allow us to be on the program, he comments. But because the San Francisco meeting consisted of contributed papers of uniform 20-minute length with a little discussion time, Chappelle expects this other meeting to be more productive. For one, the dissidents are a featured part of the program, sponsoring 6 of the 10 symposia. The symposium format allows more flexibility in paper lengths and more time for discussion. It then goes on to explain that the mainstream physicists would have dismissed the papers presented if they were reviewed. So they didn't review them. And Goodman explains it as follows. At neither divisional meeting did physicists referee the papers of the dissident group. According to Chappelle, Aldrich, the liaison to the Pacific Division from the AAAS's national office, and also the chairwoman of its general and interdisciplinary science section, promised him no physicist would review the contributed papers to the San Francisco meeting. Aldrich says physicists would have rejected the papers out of hand. She adds that review by physicists was not necessary, since it was wasn't a physics session but a history of science and interdisciplinary science session. So basically it's a bit of a bluff off. They were trying to say that these talks were not physics talks, they were really about the history of science and so forth, and wasn't really a proper physics session. Goodman goes on and explains Donald Nash, a geneticist at Colorado State University, says he chatted informally with other physicists about the dissidents' plans for the swarm meeting. They told him he recalls that it would not hurt for the group to be heard, despite being out of the mainstream. In the long run, Nash maintains, bad science tends not to win out. And that really raised the question of what is bad science, because from the dissidents' point of view, the establishment is doing bad science. The establishment being the physics establishment are doing bad science. Goodman continues, for the most part, mainstream physicists have been unaware of the criticism directed their way at these AAAS divisional meetings. For one, divisional meetings are heavily biological, with little participation by physical scientists, typically. Urged by Pacific Division officers to balance the session with response from the mainstream, Chappelle sent invitations to many university physics departments. He was ignored, so they were trying to present dissidents physics, and most of the mainstream physics people were ignoring it. And being ignored is what usually happens to dissidents when they try to contact the mainstream. They just end up getting ignored. So this is Clifford Will, a specialist in relativity, and he agrees at least one thing with Chappelle. The dissidents cannot publish in mainstream journals. They're not in mainstream journals, and it's because they are wrong, he declares. And now, from the point of view of dissidents, it's instead physicists such as this that are wrong. And the interesting thing to note is also that even though mainstream physics journals don't want articles saying Einstein's wrong published from the dissidents then just publish elsewhere. According to Wikipedia, Clifford Will is a Canadian-born theoretical physicist noted for his contributions to general relativity. And according to Clifford Will, special relativity has been confirmed by experiment so many times that it borders on crackpot to say there is something wrong with it. And our dissidents' point of view tends to be those experiments are misinterpreted and being misrepresented. So we're not agreeing that experiments are confirming special relativity. Such comments as by Clifford Will seem to totally ignore that the same data can be interpreted from empirically equivalent theories. And this is as per the philosophy of science. And I'm quoting the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy here. Every theory, it is said, has an empirically equivalent rivals, and that is, rivals that agree with respect to the observable, that is the data, but differ with respect to the unobservable. This then serves as the basis of a skeptical argument regarding the truth of any particular theory the realist may wish to endorse. So basically, empirically equivalent theories, you can have lots of different empirically equivalent theories, and they can be applied to the same data. And they might only differ then in data which has not been gathered by experiment, which is meaning the observed data, which you've got all these theories are agreeing with that, but for the data which you haven't extended to other ranges of testing, which has been unobserved, they might not be agreeing. Clifford Will continues, experiments have been done to test special relativity. Explicitly, the Will's particle accelerators would not work if special relativity wasn't in effect. And you should see my talk, Special Relativity, the Pedagogical Trick. Feynman says there is relativistic mass, and another relativist, Lincoln, says there isn't. And the usual teaching is that relativistic mass is involved in particle accelerators. So something quirky is going on there. One person is saying there is relativistic mass involved in particle accelerators, and the other person is saying it isn't. Clifford Will continues, the Global Positioning System, GPS, which uses satellites to help determine the exact location on Earth of anything possessing a special transmitter, would not work if special relativity didn't work the way we thought it did. However, at CNPS, we had this person, a GPS engineer, saying GPS didn't work by by Einstein's relativity, and he used a different theory than Einstein's relativity for GPS. Personally, I think it's probably in part of empirically equivalent theories again. And a quote from the CNPS website. So you hear almost every day how GPS is a practical example of the use of Einstein's relativity. It must be true, right? Wrong. Just ask Ron Hatch. Ron Hatch, a critical thinker, holds over 30 patents in GPS and one of the most decorated GPS scientists on the planet, and he says that GPS doesn't support relativity but actually shows flaws in the theory. So we have two people here saying different things. Clifford Will is saying that GPS works by Einstein's relativity, and an actual person who set up the GPS says it doesn't. So there's something quirky going on again here. Goodman continues and says, Will asserts Chappelle is way off base. The global positioning system provides evidence against special relativity for the existence of an ether, or he provides evidence against the existence of an ether, is what is meant. And for those in the CPS, they think Will is way off base, as pointed out, with the authority of a GPS engineer who's disagreeing with Clifford Will, and also disagree about the ether issue. Goodman continues, at the Pacific Division meeting, Chappelle managed to attract two mainstream physicists to participate in formal discussions with them. And Goodman then goes on, one, Louis Epstein, a retired physicist with a background in the United States space program and academia, has observed the distance for many years. He wrote a popular book, Relativity Visualized, in 1981, which he notes was motivated in part to get through to the sort of sophisticated, interested person that many of the dissidents are. There are fools mixed in, according to Epstein, of the dissidents, but by and large they're not fools. They can make arguments against relativity that can tie up a typical college teacher in knots. And it's probably because the dissidents can tie up a typical physics teacher in knots. It's one of the reasons that the establishment don't want to engage in conversation with dissidents, because they might then lose to the dissident. As per Wikipedia, Louis Epstein is author of 11 books on physics and uses an idiosyncratic mix of cartoons. Goodman carries on. Epstein emphasizes that the dissidents do not uniformly support a single theory to replace special relativity. They all have different theories, and some have 2 or 3. It takes quite an effort to argue them all down, he says. You argue them down and they'll be back a week later with another theory. It reminds me of the dragon. When you lop off its head, it grows new ones. And that's true. There is a problem with uniting the dissidents. Some believe in some type of ether theory and others believe other types of theories. When reading Einstein's relativity, if you want to find fault with it, then there's too many different directions that one can go in. And also, it's still the issue of empirically equivalent theories. If you've got Einstein's special relativity and you think it's wrong, well, you're going to try to form another theory, and there's lots of empirically equivalent theories you could then start forming. It's just the problem of in physics that you can do that, and that is stated in the philosophy of science that is what happens. So Epstein just doesn't really seem to realise that this many-headed dragon, that is the problem with physics. Goodman carries on. The mainstream won't pay attention to them, that's the distance, because it takes a lot of effort to lop off the head of the dragon. Mainstream physicists don't have the time, and this is the quoting Epstein. There is no reward in it. Hence, I conclude that this is another reason why the mainstream prefers to ignore the dissidents. Goodman continues about Epstein. Despite his criticisms, Epstein has a certain respect for many of the dissidents. They had their heart in the right place, he says, in some ways more than a typical college professor. These people are genuinely in love with physics. Their heart has led them astray. Very few dissidents hold university positions, and most of those that do are in fields other than physics. And I'm pointing out the problem is if you disagree with Einstein's relativity, then it's difficult to get an academic job dealing with Einstein's relativity, if you're taking that point of view. So usually you have to go somewhere else. Goodman carries on. Dominus Spencer, one prominent dissident, is a mathematician, and so that's an example of a mathematician looking at Einstein's relativity and deciding there is something wrong with it. Goodman then carries on and points out Howard Hayden may be the only tenured physicist among the dissidents, and that's an example of a dissident physicist. So there is at least one dissident physicist in that group, and of course a dissident mathematician. That's quite impressive as well. This is Howard Hayden, and if you look into him, he seems to have quite controversial points of view anyway on lots of subjects. Unfortunately, Hayden, as dissident physicist, doesn't say anything helpful to the dissident cause. As Goodman reports on him, Hayden attended the San Francisco meeting but found it not very useful. I was happy to make the acquaintance of 2 or 3 people, he says. This is Hayden, but the majority of talks were off the wall, and presumably off the wall means bad. Hayden, who like most of the dissidents, feels that special relativity has not been properly tested, nevertheless dismisses many of his fellow dissidents as just rebels against authority. So Hayden, as the dissident physicist, he thinks special relativity has not been properly tested, but he's not really wanting to go along with what the other dissidents are saying. Goodman then points out Chappelle says Hayden is only a partial critic of special relativity and doesn't appreciate all the criticisms of special relativity. He doesn't appreciate the philosophical arguments, for example. And so that's an attempt to deal with Hayden not giving enough support to them all. In interviews, Chappelle seems very attuned to slights from mainstream physics and determined to improve the visibility of the dissidents. And with all that, he seemed to have failed. Ultimately, Chappelle maintains the dissidents would like to reform science and move it ahead. Huge mistakes have been made. Physicists are just not talking about the physical world. So they're not agreeing with Einstein's relativity as being an accurate description of what's going on in the physical world. In Chappelle's view, special relativity has nothing to do with the various applications supposed to confirm it, such as the atom bomb or the global positioning system. Back to what a relativist thinks. Relativist, as Will, doesn't quarrel with the dissidents presenting their views in contributed paper sessions at the AAAS, as they also can at national meetings of the American Physical Society if they're members, and it'd be difficult if they're not physicists to be. They probably have to be a physicist to be a member of something like that. So they only seem to have one person for that. But he expresses doubts about allowing them a symposium that gives them a stamp of credibility that simply doesn't exist. So he doesn't want to give them a stamp of credibility. It means he wants to try to block them from attending any future events if he can. And Goodman's pointing out several mainstream physicists interviewed by the scientists, which is the magazine reporting on this, including some friendly with individual dissidents, comment that there is little of substance to the dissidents' criticisms, i.e. they're dismissing the dissident criticisms of relativity. Aldrich, Nash and other non-physicists involved the AAAS meetings apparently think the dissidents are operating at the fringes of physics, where ideas might be unpopular but worth hearing. As Aldrich puts it, it's interesting to see who goes to their sessions. Often it's graduate students who want to see what is happening at the margins. The physics community, meanwhile, locates the dissidents not at the fringes but light years away. And from the graduate students, sometimes the graduate students decide that they've been lied to in their physics education. I came via that route. As you'd see, for instance, the pedagogical trick video, where educators think they are justified in lying to their students if it enables their students to grasp what would be otherwise difficult concepts to grasp, i.e. they're dumbing things down when they're teaching physics. So the mainstream just likes to keep sweeping certain things under the carpet, there's a great deal of opposition to Einstein's relativity, and the mainstream just wants to ignore that. Finn, thank you. The end. Thank you for your time.